What if America's failure to understand China isn't a temporary intelligence gap or a mistake? That can be fixed with better data, better analysts, or better briefing memos, but something deeper and more structural. What if the problem isn't that America lacks information about China, but that it keeps using the wrong mental lenses to interpret what it sees? For more than a century, American policymakers, journalists, economists, and strategists have tried to read China's trajectory. Again and again, they have made confident predictions. China will collapse under its own contradictions. Rising wealth will inevitably produce Western-style democracy. Market reforms will weaken the Communist Party. Authoritarian systems can't innovate at scale. Every time China deviates from these expectations, the reaction in Washington is surprise, frustration, and then another round of explanations about why the prediction was right in theory but wrong in timing. This isn't just a record of bad forecasts. It's a pattern. And patterns usually point to a flawed framework rather than bad luck. The United States tends to analyze China through categories that make sense in an American and European historical experience. Democracy versus authoritarianism, markets versus the state, individual freedom versus government control. These categories are treated as universal, almost like laws of political gravity. If a society becomes richer, it should demand more political rights. If the state interferes too much, growth should slow. If innovation is restricted, technological leadership should fade. China has spent the last 40 years violating these expectations without apologizing for it. It has combined aggressive state coordination with market mechanisms. It has lifted hundreds of millions of people out of poverty while tightening political control. It has become a global leader in advanced manufacturing, infrastructure, and emerging technologies under a one-party system that American theory says should be brittle and stagnant. When American analysts confront this contradiction, the usual response is to treat China as an anomaly, a temporary exception, a system that looks stable now but will inevitably break later. Collapse is always coming, just not yet. Democratization is inevitable, just delayed. The model itself is rarely questioned. This is where the misunderstanding begins. America tends to approach China as if it were a version of the Soviet Union that hasn't failed yet, or a developing country that hasn't finished modernizing. But China doesn't see itself that way. It doesn't understand itself primarily as a regime type competing on a global ideological spectrum. It understands itself as a civilization state with thousands of years of continuity, interruption, adaptation, and reinvention. That distinction matters more than most American commentary admits. In the American political imagination, states are relatively young. The United States itself is less than 250 years old. Institutions are designed, revised, scrapped, and replaced within living memory. Political legitimacy is closely tied to elections, formal representation, and written constitutional rules. Change is often framed as progress, and stability can be treated as stagnation. China's political memory operates on a different time scale. Dynasties rise and fall, but the underlying civilizational identity persists. Periods of chaos are not abstract historical concepts. They are remembered as disasters that brought famine, invasion, and mass death. Stability is not merely desirable. It is morally charged. This difference alone explains a great deal of America's confusion. When American policymakers criticize China's emphasis on order, hierarchy, and centralized authority, they are often speaking from a worldview shaped by the Enlightenment, where individual autonomy and skepticism of power are seen as universal goods. Chinese political culture, shaped by Confucian traditions and reinforced by modern revolutionary history, places far more weight on social harmony, collective welfare, and competent governance. That doesn't mean there are no dissenting voices inside China or no dissatisfaction with aspects of the system. It means legitimacy is not evaluated using the same criteria Americans instinctively apply. Many Americans assume that the Chinese population quietly yearns for a Western-style political system and that economic growth has merely postponed an inevitable demand for liberal democracy. This assumption is comforting, but it rests more on American expectations than Chinese realities. For large segments of the Chinese population, especially those old enough to remember poverty, instability, or political chaos, the last 4 decades are not interpreted as a betrayal of democratic destiny. They are experienced as a dramatic improvement in material life, national strength, and personal security. The comparison many people make is not between China and an idealized Western democracy, but between China now and China within living memory. That perspective rarely survives translation into American media narratives. Another core misunderstanding lies in how America interprets Chinese governance. In American political culture, leadership is often associated with charisma, persuasion, and electoral performance. In China, leadership is more closely tied to administrative competence and bureaucratic progression. Advancement typically requires managing cities, provinces, and complex institutions before reaching the highest levels. This does not make the system transparent, fair, or immune to corruption. It does mean that legitimacy is often derived from perceived performance rather than popular vote. American observers frequently dismiss this distinction, assuming that without elections, legitimacy must be purely coercive. That assumption oversimplifies how authority actually functions in Chinese society. These misunderstandings compound when America tries to predict Chinese behavior on the global stage. American strategy often assumes that China will prioritize ideological expansion, regime export, or short-term disruption. In reality, Chinese decision-making is often driven by historical memory, risk aversion, and a deep sensitivity to perceived vulnerability. Few concepts illustrate this better than what China refers to as the century of humiliation. From the mid-19th century to the mid-20th century, China experienced foreign domination, territorial loss, internal collapse, and repeated national trauma. In American discourse, this period is treated as background history. In China, it functions as a living narrative that shapes attitudes towards sovereignty, security, and foreign pressure. When American policymakers dismiss Chinese reactions as paranoia or propaganda, they miss how deeply this historical experience informs strategic thinking. Issues like Taiwan, trade dependence, technological self-sufficiency, and military modernization are not isolated policy debates. They are interpreted through a lens of preventing national weakness from ever recurring. This is where America's analytical habits become dangerous. American political analysis tends to isolate variables. Economic growth is treated separately from political control. Nationalism is separated from development policy. Technology is analyzed independently from historical identity. Chinese thinking is far more relational. These elements are seen as interconnected parts of a single system, where changing one affects all the others. When America assumes that pressure in one domain will automatically produce predictable outcomes in another, it repeatedly miscalculates. Sanctions are expected to trigger political instability. Trade restrictions are assumed to slow innovation. Diplomatic criticism is believed to produce internal reform. Instead, these actions often reinforce domestic cohesion and accelerate adaptation. The result is a cycle of failed expectations. America predicts one outcome. China produces another. Rather than revisiting the framework, the explanation becomes that China is abnormal, deceptive, or temporarily defying gravity. At some point, repeated failure stops being coincidence. The real question is not why China refuses to follow America's script. The real question is why America keeps insisting on using a script that was never written for China in the first place. In the next part, we'll look at how these misunderstandings harden into official policy, how decades of confident prediction shaped engagement strategies that never delivered what America expected, and why the consequences of this misreading are becoming harder to ignore. Once these misunderstandings took hold, they didn't stay confined to academic debates or think tank papers. They hardened into official policy. Over time, America built an entire strategy toward China on assumptions that felt logical inside Western political theory, but were poorly aligned with Chinese realities. For much of the late 20th century, the dominant American belief was convergence. The idea was simple and reassuring. If China were integrated into the global economy, if it traded with the world, joined international institutions, welcomed foreign investment, and adopted market mechanisms, it would gradually begin to resemble liberal democracies. Political openness would follow economic openness. Reform would naturally lead to reform. This belief shaped decisions at the highest levels. China was brought into global trade systems. Access to markets was expanded. Technology transfers were encouraged. Engagement was framed not just as profitable, but as transformative. The assumption was that exposure to global capitalism would erode centralized control and empower civil society. What this framework failed to consider was that China did not view economic reform as a pathway toward Western political models. It viewed reform as a tool for national rejuvenation under continued centralized authority. Markets were not adopted to weaken the state, but to strengthen it. Openness was selective, conditional, and always subordinate to political control. From the Chinese perspective, there was no contradiction between one-party rule and market-driven growth. The contradiction existed only inside American expectations. As China's economy expanded, American confidence in convergence only grew. Rising incomes were interpreted as proof that political liberalization was inevitable. When liberalization failed to materialize, the explanation became timing. China was not different, just slower. Democracy was delayed, not denied. This logic survived repeated shocks. After the events of 1989, many American policymakers assumed that political repression would either trigger internal collapse or force meaningful reform. Instead, China tightened control, adjusted its governing mechanisms, and doubled down on economic development. Growth resumed. Living standards rose. The system adapted. Rather than reassessing the underlying assumptions, American strategy largely returned to engagement, convinced that economic forces would eventually overpower political resistance. This created a strange disconnect. The same system that was criticized as illegitimate was simultaneously treated as a reliable partner for trade, investment, and global supply chains. For China's leadership, the lesson was clear. Economic growth and political control were not mutually exclusive. In fact, they could reinforce each other. Rising prosperity could be framed as evidence of the system's effectiveness. Stability could be presented as the condition that made growth possible. This realization fundamentally altered the balance of confidence between Washington and Beijing. As the 21st century progressed, China's scale began to overwhelm American assumptions. It became the world's manufacturing hub, a central node in global logistics, and a major source of infrastructure financing. Entire industries came to depend on Chinese production. Supply chains stretched across continents. Yet American analysis often treated these developments as temporary or reversible. China was still expected to plateau. Demographics would catch up. Debt would explode. Inefficiencies would accumulate. The narrative of inevitable slowdown or collapse remained intact, even as evidence accumulated to the contrary. This pattern created strategic complacency. Because American policymakers believed China's rise was self-limiting, they delayed difficult adjustments. Industrial hollowing was rationalized as efficient globalization. Dependence on Chinese manufacturing was framed as mutually beneficial interdependence. Long-term vulnerabilities were discounted because the underlying assumption was that China would eventually conform or falter. When that didn't happen, the response was abrupt and disoriented. By the late 2010s, American policy swung sharply from engagement to confrontation. Tariffs replaced trade liberalization. Technology restrictions replaced integration. Strategic competition replaced partnership. The language changed almost overnight, but the underlying misunderstanding remained. Instead of asking why previous predictions failed, the new approach often assumed that pressure would finally force China into predictable behavior. Sanctions would slow growth. Export controls would halt innovation. Economic stress would translate into political instability. Once again, the framework relied on linear cause and effect assumptions drawn from Western experience. China responded not with collapse, but with acceleration. Supply chains were localized. Indigenous innovation was prioritized. Strategic industries were insulated. The very pressures designed to weaken the system were reinterpreted as proof that self-reliance was essential. This is where American policy began to undermine itself. Measures intended to preserve technological advantage often strengthened China's resolve to build alternatives. Restrictions on advanced components encouraged domestic substitution. Financial pressure reinforced nationalist narratives. External criticism validated internal warnings about foreign dependence. From an American perspective, these responses were often described as defiance or aggression. From a Chinese perspective, they were defensive adaptations rooted in historical experience. The same misreading appears in how America interprets Chinese nationalism. In American discourse, nationalism is often treated as a tool used by authoritarian governments to distract from internal weakness. While this can be true, it misses the depth of China's historical memory. Nationalism in China is not only manufactured, it is cultivated by shared narratives of vulnerability, humiliation, and recovery. When American leaders frame competition with China as a moral crusade or ideological struggle, they often believe they are appealing to universal values. Inside China, this framing is frequently interpreted as containment or subversion. Rather than encouraging reform, it hardens resistance. This does not mean China is immune to internal pressures or policy mistakes. It means external pressure does not operate the way American models predict. Another major blind spot lies in how America interprets Chinese planning. Long-term strategies are often dismissed as propaganda or unrealistic ambition. Targets are assumed to be aspirational rather than operational. But Chinese governance places extraordinary emphasis on implementation, iteration, and feedback. Plans are adjusted rather than abandoned. Failures are analyzed internally, even when denied publicly. Local experimentation feeds national policy. This creates a system that is less flexible in political expression, but highly adaptive in economic and technological domains. American observers frequently underestimate this adaptive capacity because it doesn't resemble democratic responsiveness. Change happens quietly, bureaucratically, and incrementally rather than through visible political turnover. As a result, America repeatedly mistakes silence for stagnation and control for fragility. These errors accumulate. They distort risk assessments. They skew investment decisions. They influence military planning. They shape public expectations. When reality diverges from prediction, trust in expertise erodes. Analysts double down. Narratives become more extreme. China is portrayed either as an unstoppable threat or a collapsing house of cards. Both interpretations are products of the same flawed framework. The most damaging consequence is not that America disagrees with China's system. It is that America keeps misjudging how that system actually works. And misjudgment, when translated into policy, has costs. In the next phase of this story, we need to examine how these analytical failures affect concrete areas of conflict and cooperation, from technology and trade to security and diplomacy, and why misunderstanding China on its own terms makes every one of those challenges harder to manage. Nowhere are these misunderstandings more consequential than in the areas where economics, technology, and security intersect. This is where abstract frameworks turn into concrete risks, and where getting China wrong stops being an academic problem and starts becoming a strategic liability. American policymakers often assume that pressure in these domains will produce clear, controllable outcomes. Restrict technology and innovation slows. Apply economic costs and political pressure rises. Signal military resolve and deterrence stabilizes behavior. These assumptions are drawn from American historical experience, where institutions are transparent, incentives are linear, and policy feedback is relatively immediate. China operates differently. Take technology. In American discourse, innovation is closely tied to decentralization, open competition, and private initiative. The assumption follows that state involvement distorts incentives and suppresses creativity. When American officials argue that China's political system is incompatible with sustained innovation, they are projecting a Western model onto a fundamentally different environment. China treats technology as a strategic domain, not merely an economic one. Research priorities are aligned with national objectives. Long-term funding is insulated from short-term market pressure. Failure is tolerated when it contributes to learning. Duplication is accepted as redundancy rather than inefficiency. This approach does not always produce elegant outcomes, but it does produce scale, speed, and persistence. When access to advanced components is restricted, the expectation in Washington is often that progress will stall. In practice, constraints tend to trigger substitution, re-engineering, and domestic investment. Progress may slow temporarily, but dependency decreases. Over time, the system adapts. American analysts frequently interpret this adaptation as imitation rather than innovation. But that distinction matters less than capability. From a strategic standpoint, functional equivalence can be just as consequential as originality. The same misreading appears in trade policy. Tariffs are often framed as leverage, tools designed to force concessions by imposing economic pain. This logic assumes that economic pressure will translate into political bargaining. But in China, trade policy is tightly linked to employment stability, social cohesion, and regime legitimacy. When trade becomes politicized, the response is rarely capitulation. It is insulation. Supply chains are diversified. Domestic demand is emphasized. Strategic reserves are expanded. The costs are absorbed internally and reframed as necessary sacrifices in a longer national project. This does not mean trade pressure has no effect. It means the effects are distributed and managed differently than American models predict. Security dynamics follow a similar pattern. American military planning emphasizes signaling, deterrence, and escalation control. It assumes that adversaries interpret signals in roughly similar ways. But Chinese strategic culture is shaped by a history of invasion, encirclement, and internal collapse. From Beijing's perspective, proximity matters. Geography matters. Buffer zones matter. What American planners describe as routine presence operations can be interpreted as persistent pressure. What Washington sees as defensive alliances can be viewed as constricting networks. This difference in perception creates risk. When American officials emphasize freedom of navigation or alliance commitments, they often assume the message will be received as reassurance. In Chinese strategic thinking, repeated demonstrations near sensitive areas may reinforce the belief that vulnerability is increasing, not decreasing. This does not excuse coercive behavior or territorial assertiveness. It explains why actions intended to stabilize can sometimes accelerate confrontation. Taiwan is the clearest example. In American political discourse, Taiwan is often framed primarily as a democratic partner and a test of credibility. Support is articulated in moral and legal terms. The issue is discussed as if it were one variable among many in a broader strategic competition. In China, Taiwan is not treated as a variable. It is treated as an unresolved Civil War legacy tied directly to national identity and historical trauma. The timeline is measured in decades, not election cycles. Signals are interpreted through a lens of permanence and resolve rather than negotiation. When American commentary treats Taiwan policy as flexible or symbolic, it collides with Chinese perceptions that see the issue as existential. Misunderstanding this gap does not make conflict inevitable, but it raises the probability of miscalculation. Another area where American frameworks struggle is crisis interpretation. American political culture is accustomed to open debate, public disagreement, and visible institutional friction. In China, disagreement is largely internalized. Decisions appear sudden because deliberation happens out of sight. This creates a dangerous asymmetry. When Chinese actions appear abrupt, American observers may interpret them as impulsive or irrational. In reality, they may be the result of prolonged internal assessment reaching a tipping point. Conversely, American policy shifts driven by electoral change can appear erratic or unserious from Beijing's perspective. Each side believes the other is unpredictable, when in fact they are predictable according to different internal logics. The media environment amplifies these distortions. American coverage often oscillates between alarmism and dismissal. One week China is portrayed as an unstoppable juggernaut. The next is depicted as a system on the verge of collapse. Both narratives attract attention. Neither encourage nuanced understanding. This volatility seeps into public opinion and policy discourse. Leaders face pressure to respond to simplified narratives rather than complex realities. Subtle adjustments are harder to justify than dramatic gestures. Meanwhile, Chinese media reinforces its own narratives of encirclement and resilience. External criticism is filtered through historical memory. Domestic audiences are primed to interpret pressure as confirmation of hostile intent. These feedback loops harden positions on both sides. The danger is not that America and China disagree. Disagreement is normal between major powers. The danger is that each side increasingly operates with a distorted model of the other's motivations, thresholds, and red lines. When strategy is built on misperception, even rational decisions can produce unstable outcomes. This is where misunderstanding becomes more than a failure of analysis. It becomes a driver of escalation. If American policymakers believe China is fundamentally brittle, they may overestimate the effectiveness of pressure. If Chinese leaders believe America is committed to permanent containment, they may accelerate timelines and narrow options. Neither assumption needs to be true for behavior to shift as if it were. This dynamic leaves less room for error, less space for compromise, and fewer off-ramps during crisis. Small incidents carry greater symbolic weight. Signals are read pessimistically. Ambiguity becomes threatening. At this stage, the problem is no longer simply that America misunderstands China. It is that this misunderstanding is shaping choices in domains where mistakes are costly and sometimes irreversible. Understanding how these perceptions interact is essential to avoiding outcomes that neither side may actually want. In the final part, we need to confront the hardest question of all, whether America can adjust its frameworks without abandoning its values, and whether a stable relationship is possible when two systems organize themselves according to fundamentally different logics. At the deepest level, America's difficulty with China is not a lack of data, access, or intelligence. It is a problem of interpretation. The United States keeps approaching China with frameworks that assume convergence, universality, and linear progress, even after decades of evidence that these assumptions do not hold. Western political culture, and American culture in particular, is built on the idea that certain values are not only preferable but inevitable. Individual rights, electoral legitimacy, and liberal institutions are treated as the endpoint of modernization. When societies become wealthier, more educated, and more connected, they are expected to move in this direction. This belief has been powerful because it worked, at least partially, in parts of Europe and the Americas. It has also been comforting. If history bends toward a familiar outcome, then patience is a strategy. Engagement becomes an investment in inevitability. China disrupts this narrative. China's modern trajectory suggests that economic modernization does not automatically produce Western political forms, that technological advancement can coexist with centralized authority, and that legitimacy can be derived from performance, stability, and national revival rather than electoral competition. For many Americans, acknowledging this feels uncomfortably close to endorsing it. But understanding is not endorsement. Recognizing how China operates does not require proving of censorship, surveillance, or human rights abuses. It requires accepting that condemnation alone does not explain behavior or produce effective strategy. One of the most persistent American mistakes has been confusing moral clarity with analytical clarity. It is possible to be morally opposed to aspects of China's system while still needing to understand it accurately. In fact, without accurate understanding, moral criticism often becomes strategically ineffective. This confusion shows up repeatedly in policy debates. When American leaders speak about democracy promotion, they often assume the language translates cleanly across cultures. In China, the same language is frequently interpreted as an attempt to delegitimize the state and weaken national cohesion. The result is not reform, but defensiveness. When American officials frame competition as a battle between freedom and authoritarianism, they may rally domestic audiences, but they also reinforce Chinese narratives of encirclement and ideological hostility. These narratives, rooted in historical experience, make compromise harder, not easier. Another source of misunderstanding lies in how Americans think about change. American political life is noisy, visible, and fast-moving. Elections reset priorities. Leadership changes bring abrupt shifts. Debate happens in public. To American observers, systems that lack these features can appear rigid or frozen. China's system changes differently. Adjustment is incremental, bureaucratic, and often opaque. Policies evolve through experimentation at local levels before scaling nationally. Errors are corrected internally without public admission. To outside observers, this can look like stasis. In reality, it is a different mode of adaptation. This difference has led America to repeatedly underestimate China's capacity to absorb shocks. Financial crises, trade pressure, demographic stress, and external criticism have all been predicted to produce rapid breakdown. Instead, China has responded by reallocating resources, tightening control, and redefining priorities. This does not make the system invulnerable. It makes it resilient in ways that American models do not easily capture. Another mistake is treating Chinese public opinion as either irrelevant or unknowable. While China is not a liberal democracy, public sentiment still matters. Stability depends on perceptions of competence, fairness, and national dignity. The leadership is acutely aware of this, which is why economic performance, social order, and sovereignty are treated as inseparable goals. Many Americans assume that the absence of open dissent means the absence of consent. That assumption overlooks how expectations are shaped by history. For people whose grandparents lived through famine, war, and humiliation, the baseline for legitimacy is not abstract rights, but tangible improvement and security. This gap in expectations is rarely acknowledged in American debates. The result of all these misunderstandings is a strategy that oscillates between misplaced optimism and exaggerated fear. For years, America assumed China would become more like the West. When that failed, the narrative flipped to inevitability of conflict. Engagement gave way to containment. Cooperation was reframed as vulnerability. Both approaches share the same flaw. They are built on assumptions about what China should become rather than an assessment of what China is. A more realistic approach begins with abandoning the idea of convergence. China is not on a delayed path toward becoming a Western-style democracy. It is becoming more Chinese, not less. Modern, technologically advanced, globally connected, but organized around its own historical logic. Accepting this does not mean surrendering American values. It means separating values from predictions. America can defend human rights, support allies, and protect its interests without assuming that pressure will transform China's internal system. It can compete economically and technologically without believing that decoupling will cause collapse. It can deter military aggression without interpreting every Chinese action as ideological expansion. This requires intellectual discipline. It requires analysts who understand Chinese history not as background trivia, but as a living force. It requires policymakers who can distinguish between symbolic gestures that play well domestically and strategies that actually shape behavior. It requires media narratives that resist the temptation to swing between hype and denial. Most of all, it requires humility. For decades, American expertise on China has been crowded with confident predictions that did not come true. Collapse was always coming. Democratization was always imminent. Innovation was always unsustainable. Each failure was explained away rather than confronted. At some point, the problem is not China's unpredictability. It is America's refusal to question its own frameworks. The world is entering a period where power is shared between societies organized around very different assumptions. One prizes individual autonomy and public contestation. The other prioritizes collective order and administrative competence. Neither system is likely to disappear. Neither can be reduced to a caricature. The danger ahead is not that China is rising. Rising powers are a recurring feature of history. The danger is that America continues to misunderstand that rise, continues to project its own logic onto a system that operates differently, and continues to make policy based on expectations that reality keeps contradicting. Understanding China on its own terms does not guarantee harmony, but misunderstanding it guarantees friction. The choice facing America is not whether it approves of China's system. The choice is whether it wants to deal with China as it actually exists, or keep arguing with a version of China that exists only in Western theory. You don't have to like what you see. You don't have to agree. But you do have to see clearly. Because when great powers misread each other's motives, incentives, and limits, the cost is rarely paid in theory. Thanks for watching. If you want to explore how China's rise is perceived around the world and why it generates such fear and confusion, you can continue with the next video.